Holy City Center Radio is episode 403, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Monday, August 25th, 2025. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. So happy to have you here. I hope you had an awesome weekend and have a great week ahead. Yeah, we had a lot of rain, as I'm sure you all noticed over the last several days. Lots of flooding in the areas you would expect there to be flooding. Thankfully, outside of that, doesn't seem like anything too crazy happened. Certainly concerning. Every time we have a storm like this, it's not even a hurricane. It wasn't even a tropical storm. It was just raining. And granted, a lot of rain over a long period of time. And there were some instances where a lot of rain fell in a short period of time. So, I know this isn't like a typical just one-off, a storm for, 20 minutes or whatever. But still concerning when you think a tropical storm and obviously a hurricane, when you add those winds, of course. I was just worried about the flooding. You think how much more rain and flooding could happen, especially if things work out with the tides and on. And then, you add those strong winds in there and it's just a reminder that we have been lucky to not have a very significant storm cause as much damage, as it could potentially. I know we've had some, storms skirt by, and there was certainly a good amount of damage from flooding and stuff. But man, it's nothing like if we get anything close. It's I hate to start off the podcast this way, but it made me think of it. I'm sure some of you did too. Like, man, it's the 20th anniversary around this time frame also of Hurricane Katrina hitting, specifically New Orleans. Obviously, other places were affected, but that was the main city. And it just reminds you that if right conditions, and by right meaning wrong for us, and a bigger storm and a direct hit or nearby hit, it can do a lot of damage to places like New Orleans or, Miami, say, and all sorts of other places along the coast of Florida. And of course, us, South Carolina, and even up to North Carolina. Like, it could be pretty devastating. We saw what happened with North Carolina, when they got, more, wet weather than they were expecting, especially in the mountains. So, yeah, just a reminder that we are lucky and hopefully we stay lucky. And, yes, there are cuts and things that have happened to weather systems that are concerning. But at least with a hurricane, we can have an idea of when it will hit. Hopefully we won't be missing any important data, as far as how strong it is. It turns out to be stronger or a prediction is wrong. We'll see. I hope the cuts won't affect things like that. So it's just a very concerning time. It's just something to remind us like, hey, yeah, remember, if there's a big storm coming, this isn't like, we've been fine. Like, no, we should make sure we're taking the precautions and evacuations if there are any, just being vigilant and thinking about, okay, if I did have to evacuate at some point in the future, what's the best way to keep my stuff, whatever your stuff is it a house, a condo, an apartment? How do I keep it safe as possible? And, my people and my pets. Doesn't hurt to start thinking about that stuff now. Just, again, don't want to start off in a bummer like that, but I think it's important. And I was reminded of it over this past weekend, a little bit of the week and into the weekend with this rain and, seeing the videos of how deep the water was in some of the streets. Just reminds us to be vigilant and to, keep our eyes on these things. Well, with that super bummer of a start, let's get into the latest news. I guess this ties in a little bit to the top conversation. When we're worried about flooding and things, of course, we think about the Peninsula immediately. I would imagine most of us do, just because that's where we tend to hear the most about streets being flooded and closed and things like that. And the Peninsula is actually gaining residents for the first time since the 1930s. So we have even more people there than we've had in decades. So yeah, the number of people who actually live on the Peninsula has been falling for more than 80 years. Now, some of that, is not going to. I'm sure when you hear that, you're like, well, sure. There's gentrification. People are getting priced out. Number two. With just rising costs, people who used to be able to live downtown on certain jobs can't. And we've had those conversations, but I was still a little surprised by this data that, it's been falling, for 80 years straight, basically. That's, I would have thought there'd be a little bit more. Oh, there was a spike in, this 3-year period or whatever. But we're on the rebound, believe it or not. So, according to some planners, urban planners that the city has, they believe that this decade is expected to witness the peninsula's first increase in residents since the 1930s, as I mentioned. And that was when military related employment drove the population to a high point of 71,245, according to the 1940 census. So, it makes sense why there was that spike there. We know about the different bases around the area, and in that time frame. Okay, yep, all right, that makes sense. And so a fall wouldn't be out of the question, but it still is a little surprising that it's been that precipitous, like over 8 decades. In any event, those urban planners that the city of Charleston has, they also estimate that the peninsula's population has actually already started the rebound, where they think they're going to, eventually get to. And they're saying that's largely due to the many new apartment buildings that have opened on the Upper Peninsula, specifically near the Morrison Drive area. The city estimates the peninsula has gained more than 3,400 residents since 2020. Obviously the pandemic year, so keeping that in mind, which would be more than a 10% jump. So it certainly seems that, pandemic starts. I know some people moved here during it, but now as people are starting to maybe find new jobs, get back on their feet and things, maybe putting off moving somewhere, or people that lost jobs and decided, let's go somewhere new. It looks like Charleston, pulled in some of those types of folks. And looking ahead, there are several large development plans that are expected to add thousands and more apartments to the peninsula, which obviously, assuming that the trend continues, those will be filled and will boost the number of residents. So that part might be a surprise. I think a lot of this is, as I mentioned, but also the fact, yeah, you do see all these apartments and things opening, but we also are so, at least for me, when you talk about the city, particularly the peninsula, the conversation is always about downtown's not affordable. It's insane how much how high these prices are for some of these places. Gentrification, and so those high prices, the gentrification. Hearing a lot about food and beverage workers saying they can't afford to live downtown. That's like the conversation we've been hearing a lot, and I would imagine even if you're not like constantly looking at the local news like I am, that's still stuff when you talk to people around town. That's a big issue. So I think we kind of get in our head like, oh, yeah, so like no one lives there anymore. But you forget, like, no, it's actually people are filling in those places that we think are ridiculously expensive, and places that are pricing out former residents. I like I said, I just didn't. I'm like, oh yeah, right, of course. Like we're just so busy talking about how people are being forced out, we're not realizing like, oh yeah, but people are coming in for sure. It's not just businesses taking up space. There's these huge places with apartments and condos to rent or buy, and so on and so forth, and more are coming. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise, but then like I said, just being in it like that, in the weeds, you kind of forget that other side. So we might not realize it, but the city is growing, and these numbers are showing it's growing a lot, in a historic way, in a way that may surpass one of the population highs we had. And it's been, a generation since then. So this recovery of the peninsula's population, as I mentioned, it would be a bounce back from a low point that it had hit, but it's not the first time that one was predicted. So just because it's predicted doesn't necessarily mean that it'll come true. So for instance, city officials had expected about 40,000 peninsula residents would be recorded in the 2020 census. Yes, there's 2020 again. We know why some things might have gotten shooken up a little bit. So who knows? Maybe that prediction would have come true if not for this, global pandemic that we didn't plan on for sure. So in any event, instead of reaching that 40,000 level, the peninsula saw that their number dropped to 33,644, which was not only the smallest population since 1940, but the lowest number recorded since 1840. So isn't that wild? That side of us saying, oh, people are being priced out. All these places are opening. And we really did hit a low in 2020, the lowest since 1840 when they were recording populations. That's insane to think about. And again, I get the dynamics of that year, but nonetheless, the less people lived on the peninsula in 2020 than they did in 1840. That's just crazy to think about. You don't usually think of cities that way. They're usually up and up and up and up and up. And yeah, they might see some fluctuations here and there, but nothing like that. So, barring, and let's hope not, anything crazy happening, we will bounce back from that low and possibly have the highest ever recorded. So, yeah, it's just like I said, it's a very interesting story because it kind of goes against some things that you think in your head, or also that you just haven't really considered because you've been so focused on one thing. But then also hearing that part about the huge dip in 2020. Yeah, it was really interesting to read this article, and I didn't even dive into the numbers like super deep. There's way more. If you have a Post and Courier subscription, click the link in the show notes. They've got a lot more info. It's very interesting. I just kind of picked out the highlights, but definitely check it out. All right, we're going to stick with populations. So, South Carolina, we're going to zoom out of Charleston and look at the state. A report came out, and you can visit the link in the show notes. It's the City Papers article. They have even more details than I'm going to get into. But South Carolina's foreign born population, and that includes both documented and undocumented immigrants, reached record highs at the start of 2025. And this is according to a recent report for the Center for Immigration Studies, or CIS. So, whether documented or undocumented, we're reaching record numbers here in South Carolina. Again, something that we've talked about a lot. You might not think that'd be the case, considering what you're seeing on the news with all these ICE raids and people, whether they are documented or not, being taken into custody. But then I had to remind myself, yeah, but a lot of those stories that we're hearing, yeah, there might be a one-off. Like, I know there was a smaller raid here at one point in like North Charleston, if I remember correctly, a few months back. But most of these things you're seeing, these big numbers, are from, of course, blue cities. They're, New York City. We got, the National Guard now up in Washington, D.C., which saw an increase in, locking up immigrants, again, documented or undocumented. Of course, LA. So you're realizing, oh, right, it's not really happening here in South Carolina. So those numbers for the state are actually going up when you think they'd go down. And I find that interesting for a lot of reasons. And I also wonder what will happen when they kind of MAGA, pro this ICE raid, crackdown, whatever you want to call it, when they hear that, like, oh, wait a minute, it was all funny because you're taking care of those blue cities, but wait, what's happening here in my state? I just think it'll be interesting. I hope they don't catch wind of it and force more of these things going on, but nonetheless, here we are. So, in a separate analysis, a CIS researcher also reports a dramatic and what they called alarming decline in the number of working age men, both black and white, who are not in the state's workforce. This is a new thing. I hadn't heard any other reports about this, but yeah, apparently we are experiencing, despite this, population growth, people wherever they're coming from, but specifically black and white men of working age. And I don't know the numbers they use for working age, but we can all, have a number in our head, are going really far down. I just found that really interesting. So getting a lot of people coming in, but then we have two pretty significant groups in terms of the amount of population that are having lows about, the numbers of them working. So South Carolina is among 14 states that are experiencing historic population growth among people born outside of the United States. This was according again to CIS. Now, the state's foreign-born community of 46,620 people way back in 1980 has risen to 450,446 new residents in 2025 alone. That's a 909% increase. Yikes, that's a huge jump. I'm saying yikes because it's a huge number, not that I have any issue with it whatsoever. But that's a huge jump from 46,000 to 450,000. And granted, it's, from 1980 to 2025. So, we're talking 45 years, but still, that's a big increase. And so, if you're curious, the foreign born population is 8.3% of South Carolina's total population of 5.4 million people. So, on one hand, we're talking, records for the state. But also on the other hand, it's still a very small, under 10% of what makes up the entire population. So it's one of those things where the way you present it doesn't mean it's not true what you're saying, but you can make it seem like a bigger or smaller deal. And that's kind of the reason I'm bringing that up is you can take the headline and use it as a scare tactic for the people who are, again, the people who would be all for more ICE raids happening, well, probably everywhere, but specifically in South Carolina where they live. So it's easy to twist that while also realizing, yeah, that's a record number for a state, but it's still only 8.3% of the population. So it's not like, the fear that those types of folks have, this takeover is just not realistic. Putting aside the fact it's not happening anyway, but, humoring that thought process, it's a very small amount of the population. So again, it's just something that I found interesting. I wouldn't have thought that for a state like South Carolina. I love it. Diversity is great. I'm sure those of you listening agree. And it'll just be interesting to see what, if anything, people make of that report that came out. In the take this with a grain of salt category, Charleston Police say that the teen curfew that they implemented on the Peninsula has been a success. There's been very few citations issued since it went into effect earlier this summer. Now, I mean, I have no reason to doubt the police, but this is one of those hard things where you're like, is it working? Is it not working? So if you don't remember, there have been some incidents of crime involving minors that were happening specifically on the Peninsula. So the city of Charleston, the city council, although they were, the police don't have a vote or anything, they were in support of council enacting this teen curfew, which ended up prohibiting anyone 17 years old and under from being in the central business district after 9 p.m. And it was different depending on the time of year. You may remember, during the school year, it's only Thursday to Sunday, but during the school year, it's all nights. Or I'm sorry, during the summer, it's all nights. So, obviously, times when minors are less likely to be out anyway, they don't have this curfew implemented. And we know that there are some, exceptions. Say they are working, if they're of an age where they can be working downtown, and it's after 9, that's allowed. There's some other, religious activities, school activities. There's, some other exceptions. But in any event, according to police, there's only been one citation that they have issued so far, and that was really, according to them, just because the minor was committing another crime. So they were a minor out past curfew, but the real issue was they were committing a crime and probably wouldn't have gotten the citation otherwise. Because outside of that incident, police have said that they're trying to take more of an education approach. Just let these minors who may be out, like, hey, you're not supposed to be in this area at this time, and kind of explaining it to them instead of actually like writing citations. So look, if they were writing citations, I would imagine we would have access to them, as media. I'd have to double check on that because they're not, like the normal like ticket. You think of like a traffic ticket or something. And obviously they're not being arrested, so there's no record of that. So it's hard to know for sure, but it seems, and I do appreciate that they're taking, especially these early days. I know, it started earlier this summer, and we're slowly getting to fall, but we're getting there. That they're still going that route versus, writing citations or making a big deal out of situations where they don't need to be. And like I said, the fact that, according to them, the only citation they wrote about this curfew was because it was related to a crime this minor was allegedly committing. So, if there's kids being out, for now, I think that's great. Cops just advise them. Kids get home without any trouble. Cops, no trouble, and they can move on to, bigger, more important things, especially on the weekends when places like King Street, just insanely packed. So again, it's hard to really confirm all these things. I don't feel like there's any big lie or anything, but I'm, that's just like to say, hey, look, it's tough when there's really only one source of this info, and it's the police themselves. But it sounds like everything is going well so far. I've got another couple quick updates. Number one, there was a new legal challenge from Planned Parenthood seeking to preserve Medicaid payments for its health centers here in South Carolina. They are filing this legal challenge after a Supreme Court decision put the federal funding in jeopardy. So this past Thursday, Planned Parenthood South Atlantic filed an amended complaint in federal court challenging the constitutionality of executive orders from Republican Governor Henry McMaster that blocked Medicaid reimbursement for organizations providing abortions, even though the funds are used to provide other medical care. So yes, real quickly, for those who don't know, yes, Planned Parenthood is most famous in the zeitgeist for whatever reason as being a place that provides abortions. However, they do so much more than that. Regardless, there are people who believe that if they provide abortions, no federal funds should be given to them for that purpose. So there's been this, I don't know how many years, but there's been this federal reimbursements going to Planned Parenthood as long as those funds had nothing to do with abortion. So they were using them for things like contraception, cancer screenings, annual exams, testing for STDs, STIs, and that's been the case for a while. Supreme Court ruled that states could now say, never mind, no Medicaid reimbursement. Even though you weren't using Medicaid funds for abortions, the fact that you have them in your facility, we can now say no Medicaid reimbursements for you. So that's where we're at. So according to the complaint, it says that this case is about Planned Parenthood's provision of essential healthcare services other than abortion to its patients in South Carolina. They argued that terminating the provider from Medicaid would have a, quote, devastating impact on its ability to provide a wide range of non-abortion healthcare, end quote. Yes. Planned Parenthood is sometimes is a place that is really the only place that someone can go if they need services, and not just abortion services, any of the ones I mentioned before, especially in this state, which is, I forget how many counties, but it was a shocking amount of counties in the state that don't have a single OBGYN provider. A county, not a town, not a city, entire counties. And South Carolina isn't the only state that has that. And so this would just further harm people who, if a Planned Parenthood has to close now because they're not getting the Medicaid reimbursements, they will no longer be able to go to. So, they're trying to argue like, hey, you're blocking all these funds, but we're actually providing all these other services, and this is going to harm people. And, I think when it comes to abortion, as many of you know, it's a very fraught topic. People are very adamant on whichever side they're on. It's a very divisive issue. It has been for generations. And, so you, even if you disagree, you understand, I'm not that you understand, you're not surprised that this is what some have pushed for. Yeah, I know you're not using Medicaid funds for abortion, but we're just going to block all reimbursements for Medicaid just because you do offer abortion on your site. It's so short-sighted, can't you just you don't like abortions, you think there shouldn't be any period. Okay, that's your belief, but how are you justifying taking away these places that for some people is their only option for all sorts of care, cancer screenings, annual exams, the stuff I mentioned before? Just how can you justify that? So, obviously, where I stand on this, and I hope that things go differently with this lawsuit, than the Supreme Court's ruling that, states can just do this. So hopefully we'll get a better ruling. We'll see what happens. All right. It's been a bit of a dour episode. I get that. and do I always like taking joy in someone else's embarrassment? No, in fact, I hate doing that, but sometimes some people make it easy for you. So for me, this is a happy story. And I think some of you will agree. U.S. Representative Nancy Mace advertised that she would deliver a speech to more than 100 people in Myrtle Beach. For those who don't remember, she has announced a run for governor. And so she said, going to talk to 100 people in Myrtle Beach. However, eight people showed up. She ended up canceling the speech and then answered some questions from reporters. So she was expected to deliver remarks focused on, quote, protecting parental rights and advancing freedom and education, end quote, at the Moms for Liberty Horry County chapter meeting at Forward Church on Thursday, August 21st. So there's a lot to love here for me. Could have had 100, more than 100 apparently. Only 8 showed up, not just for Nancy Mace, but for this Moms for Liberty backed event. So when Representative Mace arrived, she walked in the room with her staff, and saw that more chairs were empty than occupied, and plans seemingly changed. So around 4 o'clock, which was the scheduled start time for the event, yes, only 8 people were in the room. And no, that does not include members of the press or security, which I thought might have. Mace and her team entered through a side door, walked past the stage where she had been set to speak, and went into a back room. A little while later, a member of her press team came out, spoke briefly with the event organizer, and then told reporters that Representative Mace would take questions from the press before meeting individually with attendees, meaning her speech was no longer happening. So she still spoke to the 8 that were there, which is good. She should do that. People, however many come out, you should do that. So good on her for speaking to them. But yeah, she had to cancel this big planned speech. No one wanted to hear her talk. So I'm taking that as good news, as I said, and I'm going to hold that with me for a little while. And by the way, this is by myorinews.com. One of the first times I've ever used them, on this podcast. I've seen them around. It's a local news outlet. Oh, I mean, local to South Carolina. It's in Horry County, of course. And just fantastic job reporting on this. Just amazing with the details, and well done to them. So hat tip. But also makes me wonder, if you are going to a Moms for Liberty event in Blood Red, South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, I know it's kind of a weird place because of, tourists and, part-time residents and things, but still, Horry County, and in Trump's America, Trump's the president, so this isn't like this is a down part time for him, really. I mean, MAGAism, especially in this state, very high still. And you can only get 8 people to turn out. That's not looking good for your campaign for governor. I'm hoping against hope, that people on all sides, whether Republican, Democrat, neither, they are all tired of Nancy Mace's shtick. Even if they might agree with some of her policies, people are just fed up with this pick me. I got to be on TV all the time. I have to be the main character on social media every day. They're just tired of it. And a lot of the things that she has just gone hardcore towards, she's obviously will talk about a million things a day, but this whole crusade against trans people and how she's kind of turned that into like a seemingly like completely anti-LGBTQ agenda, not just trans people. It's not that that's right, but again, from the perspective of people that might be voting for her, people don't, even if they agree with her about bathrooms or whatever, they're just tired of how she presents this stuff, the theatrics with everything she does. And I've heard that for a while now. And now I think that showed from this event. Now, like I said, I'm hoping against hope, because there was also a poll that came out or something along those lines. I forget the exact details, but it said she, of all the Republican candidates, basically she was the number one choice for, anyone who'd been asked about this, like, who would you vote for in the Republican primary? And so now part of that's name recognition, because as I said, she's all over the news. So you got to keep it both sides. People might be fed up with her to the point where they don't want to go and see her speak, but will they still vote for her? Could be interesting, especially because there's some other MAGA candidates, Alan Wilson, and even, current Lieutenant Governor Pam Evitt. She is MAGA, her and Henry McMaster in tandem. So it's really interesting to see how this event in Horry County played out. And like I said, I'm just going to hold it tight for as long as I can, because we need some good news. And that'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Lindsay Marie Collins, who does an amazing job editing each and every show through LMC Soundsystem. Thankfully, this one will have just a couple of edits, not as many as the last one, but she always does an amazing job regardless. And thank you to Tyler Boone, whose awesome music you hear in each and every show. Speaking of awesome, all of you are awesome for listening. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your week. However, I'll speak to you before the week's over. I'm already looking forward to it. Until then, good night and good luck.